Thank you so much for being part of this year's 2013 Global Social Venture Competition and being part of our community. My name is Richard Kohl. I'm a consultant who specializes in working with nonprofits and social enterprises all around the world in designing and implementing strategies for scaling up successful, promising, or proven projects. And today I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes about some of the basics that you want to be thinking about in terms of designing a scaling up strategy for your social innovation. Can I have the next slide, please? So the talk today is going to be short and cover just the basics. First we'll talk about a few definitions, then we'll talk about the sequence and strategies for scaling up, and a few very brief conclusions. To start with some key concepts, I want to distinguish between capacity and capability. Normally, especially for those of you who've worked a lot with social change, we talk about capacity building as in improving the ability for an organization to be more effective in what it does, or to be more effective in terms of how it reaches people. The problem with that definition for scaling up is that actually we need the word capacity to mean what it usually means, which is how big are we working? What's the quantity or the reach we're achieving versus what's our ability to effectively deliver those programs? Because for scale, we need both. We need both the capacity to reach the desired scale and the capability to deliver our program, our innovation, our intervention with quality and fidelity so that it has the impact we need. One of the major challenges for scaling up is the delivery system. How can we find a large-scale system, delivery mechanism, distribution mechanism that has both capacity and capability? The second definition that we're going to talk about is what do we mean by scale? And scale has two basic definitions. One is the scale of the model itself, or the program. What does the model cover? And we can scale that up by adding breadth. So let's take an example, let's say from reproductive health, where we might have a village health worker or community health worker that's trying to lower infant mortality. That woman might give 3 antenatal visits to expecting mothers. Okay? So we could scale up the breadth of that model by adding micronutrients that the village health worker would deliver. That would be expanding the model. Or we can increase the number of visits that the village health worker gives to expectant mothers. That would be adding depth. Or we could increase the quality, for example, by giving, instead of 3 weeks training to these village health workers in providing maternal care, 6 weeks of training. So they would do a better job at diagnosing, treating, and supporting the women in terms of the quality of the information, the quality of the micronutrients, the counseling that they give. Okay? All of these are examples of scaling up the model itself. The other definition that we usually use for scaling up is increasing the reach of a program, or an innovation, or an intervention. And what do we mean by that? Well, one way to increase the reach is to increase the types of beneficiaries. So for example, to stick with our antenatal care model, we might have a program that at the pilot level only targeted women who are 14 to 19. Because those are the most vulnerable women in terms of having problems in pregnancy. However, we might say this was so helpful that we're going to scale this up to women, all women of childbearing age. So that would be scaling up the reach in terms of demographics. Secondly, we could scale it up in terms of locations. We might have piloted this in a few villages, a block, a district, whatever the location and the administrative units are being used in that country. And we could say, wow, this really worked in this district. Now we're going to take it to 3 districts, 5 districts, a region, or the whole country. That's another way of scaling up. And the third would be coverage. We could say we're going to stay in this place, we're going to stay with this particular demographic category, but we've only been hitting 25% of those people, and now we're going to scale up to 75% or 100%. And that's another type of scaling up the reach. I hope what you can already jump to the conclusion is that the demographic, location, or geographic, or coverage are not mutually exclusive. We can scale up to more types of people, more places, and a greater coverage of those people or places in any given place. The other thing we can also do is simultaneously scale up the model, which is we could expand its depth, its breadth, or the quality of the model. Unfortunately, there's often a trade-off between scaling up the model and scaling up in places. And in fact, one of the things you may want to think about is, do we need to scale down our model for it to be implementable in different places, to different populations, or at higher coverage? Because the more complex the model, the greater the cost. So as you're thinking about your strategy, one of the things you want to keep in mind is, what is our goal at scale? Who are we going to deliver to, where, what coverage, and what version of the model? A scaled down version of the model or a scaled up version of the model? Okay? So using some of those concepts, we want to define scaling up as the process of sustainably increasing the reach and possibly the scope of a promising or proven program with fidelity and quality, thereby retaining some or all of its demonstrated positive impact. Now, this is a rather complicated definition, or it has many parts to it, but I want to take it apart because there are some key points here. So we start with the most common definition, which is increasing the reach. More people, more places, better coverage, more demographic groups. But we've added a few things. First of all was the scope. So that might involve making the model more high quality, or as I said a minute ago, making it simpler to be able to be scaled to reach. We've added the word sustainably. So we don't want to just take something to scale and have it disappear in a few years. So how do we build in sustainability? We want to make sure it's promising or proven. So we need to think about, what are the criteria for success that we want to make sure we meet before we go to scale? Because wouldn't it be unethical, not to mention difficult to get money and funding, to scale up a model that we don't know for sure works? And then we've added these terms, fidelity and quality. Fidelity means that we make sure we're scaling up at large scale is similar, if not identical, small scale, and it's done with quality. And the whole purpose of this is to preserve the positive impact. One of the most common problems we have at scale is that models lose their impact as they go to scale. And if you think again about the antenatal program, we can imagine it's one thing to train 50 or 100 community health workers to deliver these services, and they can do that with quality. But when you get to the thousands or maybe even tens of thousands of community health workers, there's a tendency to go to the least common denominator. And particularly the qualitative aspects of a program will decrease and disappear, and all we're left with is the quantity. In that case, for example, it might be the case that the way women interact with other women is as important as the information they transfer, but the quality of that interaction declines as we go to scale, and then the information actually doesn't get absorbed, because all we have left is some sort of rote parroting of training. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so now that we have some definitions of what do we mean by scaling up, and what kind of goals are we thinking about for scaling up, these are the key questions you need to answer for a scaling up strategy. We've already touched on two of them. One is, what is being scaled up? What is the version of your model? And I want to emphasize a few key points here. First of all, most people emphasize the technology in the model, but not the process. And the process of how things are delivered, or who delivers them, and the way they deliver them, is as important as what they deliver. Even if it's a product or service which is quite tangible, like a drug or some kind of service, how you interact with people, particularly in social services like education or health or livelihoods, can make as much difference to the impact as what you deliver. The second thing is that often there are intangible aspects of the model that are as important to its success as what you deliver. So when I'm thinking about that is what we just talked about, which is the way you deal with men or women who are your clients or beneficiaries. Are you nice to them? Do you treat them with respect? Do you understand their customs and culture, etc.? Okay? We've already talked about where, so that's the impact you're going to have. It's not just where you're scaling up, but what impact, what cost is it going to have, and is it going to be sustainable? And now we're going to talk particularly about how are you going to scale up. So if we can have the next slide. So there are three basic ways to think about scaling up. The most common, especially for social enterprises, is growing your own organization. So in that case, the key is that the originating organization, or you could call it the piloting organization, grows itself and it achieves capacity by internal growth. So that organization has the capability, it knows how to do this, and it increases its reach by increasing its capacity through internal growth. The organization itself gets bigger. And one of the key things about this is that it retains control of how the model is delivered. That's the key aspect of this. Okay? The next slide. So a different way is completely opposite, which is replication, which is the originating organization basically engages in technology transfer. So we try to find a large-scale delivery system, maybe the public health system, maybe the public education system, maybe an existing private sector distribution system, in which they have the capacity to reach large numbers of people, and we create the capability. We transfer the technology into that system. In that case, we lose control, the piloting organization loses control, and the adopting organizations have control. And we'll talk about in a minute why this issue of control is so important. The third way of scaling up is through collaboration, which is a combination, or in between, replication and collaboration, and expansion, excuse me. They have multiple roles. One way of doing that is that all have the needed capacity, all can reach a large number, but they all have different capabilities. Maybe one has training capability, one has monitoring capability, one can provide supply chains at scale, or alternatively, we reach scale by lots of small organizations working together to deliver the entire model. Okay? So you could think of that like as a network of NGOs working together to deliver the same thing, and they all deliver the same thing. In this case, the originating organization shares control with all the members that it's collaborating with. Okay? So what are the pluses and minuses of scaling up through these different mechanisms? Well, first of all, let's think about how they work. Expansion is where we have capability, the originating organization, and it grows its capacity. So the big challenge is growing capacity. For replication, it's the opposite. We have capacity, we create capability, and collaboration tries to do both. Okay? What kinds of models are easier to scale up through capability versus capacity? Well, before we answer that question, let's go to the second row, and just because we're going to come back to this control issue we've been emphasizing. Okay? And the control issue is the following question. How important is quality in terms of the impact of the model versus adaptability, which is the ability to adjust to local circumstances? The model has to be changed to be effective as you move from one place to another, even perhaps in the same country. If you're in a big country like India, or Brazil, or Nigeria, or even the United States, as you move from region to region, the people, the local customs, the transportation infrastructure can all be very different. So if you think about it, expansion, because the originating organization has control, okay, is pretty good at maintaining quality. But it's not so good at adaptability because it's going to places where the originating organization is not familiar. Replication is the opposite. In replication, the organizations that have local experience are very good at adapting the model. Their problem is control. They may say, well, we don't want to do it that way, not because it's not going to work here, but just because they're lazy or because they don't want to take on what somebody else has invented. So quality is harder to maintain with replication, but adaptability is very good. Potentially with collaboration, you can have both, okay? Or the flip side, both are difficult, okay? You can have the advantages of adaptability, but you have more control, okay? So as you start to think about it, models that are quality intensive, process intensive, where changing other people's behavior is key, you want quality to is something you want to do. If it's a technology-intensive model, like a new pill, a new drug, a new product, and delivery is not so important, then you don't need this, and replication makes more sense. The contrary with adaptability. If you have a model that you want local expertise or local knowledge is important, then replication makes more sense. So you can see in this case that expansion works well for quality, doesn't work so well for adaptability. Replication is the opposite. And then you have to think about who are we going to have to get their agreement in order to scale this up. If you're growing your organization, then the agreement is mostly internal. right? It's your board of directors, it's your funders, etc. Whereas if you're going through replication, then you have to convince other organizations, be they public sector, private sector, or other NGOs, to agree to do this. Collaboration, you also need agreement, okay? And finally, the question of incentives and organizational culture. If incentives are really important, then again, expansion is very effective, because you know that your organization has the right incentives and the right organizational culture. Your only challenge is to maintain that as you scale up, because as your organization grows, your organizational culture can change. Whereas for replication, you have to ensure that the culture of the replicating organizations is similar enough to work with the model. So if you think of, for example, a community-oriented grassroots model, NGOs have that kind of a culture, public sector tends not to. So getting compatibility on the cultural level. Now you notice I keep trading off expansion and replication, but collaboration may seem like the perfect mix. What's the problem with collaboration? The problem with collaboration is that word itself, which is how do you get all the partners to work together effectively, to agree on the same model, to agree on how funding is going to be distributed, etc. So collaboration has lots of advantages because it can both give you quality and adaptability. It is a mix of advocacy, and you can potentially find the right kind of incentives or organizational culture, but getting the incentives to align across cultures in terms of working together can be difficult. So let me just sum up with one last slide about how you put these things together. We need to start with a program or a model or an innovation that we want to scale up, and we need to know what it is, okay? Both its incentives, its intangibles, as well as the technology and how we deliver it. We need to decide where we want to scale it up, and where here means not just location, but demographics, impact, cost, and sustainability. And then we need to decide who's going to do this and what method of scaling up. Are we going to use replication? Are we going to expand? Are we going to collaborate? And who precisely are we going to do that with? Is it the government? Is it the private sector? Is it an existing distribution mechanism? Is it other NGOs or social enterprises? And finally, we need to figure out if there are gaps, whether it's capacity building or capability building, depending upon which model we choose, what that looks like and who's going to do it. And we need to make sure that all of these four pieces are aligned. This model, if implemented correctly, can achieve that impact at that cost in these places to those people, and these organizations can deliver that model effectively to achieve that impact. If we don't have that, then you need to keep iterating on the version of the model, your goals, and your method until they all align. So for example, if these organizations can't implement that model, then either you need to do capacity or capability building, or you need to simplify the model, or you need to modify your goals. But we just need to get all of these three pieces aligned, and that's it. So I hope this has been helpful. Thank you very much for your time, and good luck with your proposal and in scaling up into your work.